One woman, no rank, no clearance, and she just solved what 14 engineers couldn't. Someone get the girl to bring us another pot of coffee. We've got real combat pilots trying to solve a real problem here. The voice rang out sharp and smug, slicing clean through the tension in Fort Ironcrest's situation chamber. Colonel Travis Thorne, his ego easily outranking his flight record, didn't even look toward the far corner when he waved her off. Around him, a half-circle of green flight suits cracked muted. Sycophantic chuckles. These were the elite hand-picked from squadrons across the Western Command. And not a single one noticed the shift in the room's air, except for one man, General Mason Creed, seated quietly at the head of the steel conference table. Watched the woman in question, watched how she didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She was young, Air Force standard issue, no ribbons, no rank above her heart. She moved like someone who was used to being overlooked, calm, precise, silently refilling the carafe near the wall console. But Creed saw at that subtle brace of her stance, the way she shifted her weight slightly onto the balls of her feet, grounding herself, the micro-adjustment of a pilot, anticipating turbulence. It was nothing, and everything. And that's when it hit him. He'd only seen that kind of body language once before during a high-altitude stall test with the Spectre Echo prototypes. Only those who'd felt death spinning at 40,000 feet learned to stand like that. The meeting was supposed to be about Project Spectre F-39, America's next-generation stealth airframe. But instead of rewriting aerial supremacy, it was burning holes in the Pentagon's pockets. 2 crashes, 3 weeks, same failure left engine, asymmetric flameout, unrecoverable spin. The contractors couldn't explain it, the simulators wouldn't reproduce it, and now everyone in that room was betting their career on a fix. Colonel Thorne, clearly loving the spotlight, strode past the projection screen as it flickered with telemetry trails that looked more like cardiac arrest than aerodynamics. "It's textbook," he barked. "The fly-by-wire is overriding instinct. What we need is a stick-and-rudder man, someone who actually understands airflow, not another damn computer jockey." His eyes slid just briefly back to the young woman, now finished with her task, standing quietly near the exit. "It's about feel," he added. "You can't learn instinct from a manual." She didn't respond. Not a blink, not a breath, just stillness. So complete. It unnerved the room more than if she'd snapped back. The lead engineer, a civilian who looked like he hadn't slept in days, finally spoke, his voice cracking. "Sir, with all due respect, the spin is instantaneous. There's no correction window. We've run everything. It's not just instinct, it's impossible." The silence that followed felt like judgment. Budgets, legacies, and classified dreams hung in the air like smoke. General Creed scanned the faces around him. Tension, resignation. No one spoke. Then a sound broke the silence, a quiet, deliberate cadence, boots on polished tile, moving forward. The coffee girl walked calmly toward the whiteboard. Thorne scoffed aloud. "What is this? A joke?" She didn't answer, didn't slow. She reached for the marker, uncapped it, click, and started to write. The marker hit the board with a quiet, confident rhythm, not rushed, not unsure, like someone who'd drawn this diagram before, not in a classroom, but from memory, from somewhere near flame and velocity and blackout G-forces. The men behind her watched in frozen disbelief. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask for permission. On the whiteboard, she mapped out the precise moment where Spectre F-39's pitch vector collapsed. A sharp arc, annotated by nothing more than 3 critical timestamps and a word, rudder hesitation. Colonel Thorne shifted in place, arms folded. "You know you're writing nonsense on a billion-dollar headache." Right, still no response. But someone else had stopped blinking. Captain Jace Monroe, test pilot, squadron lead, and decorated combat veteran, leaned forward in his chair. His gaze wasn't on the diagram. It was on her left sleeve, at first. It looked like a simple utility patch, dark, matte, unremarkable. But when she raised her hand to underline the stall sequence, the fabric caught the room's lighting just enough to show what wasn't supposed to be seen. A symbol, burned black into the weave. A raven, mid-dive. Talons open, wrapped around a downward-pointing triangle. Captain Monroe's voice cut the air like a blade, soft but certain. That's not standard issue. The entire room turned, slowly. All eyes now on the ink-black patch. Thorne narrowed his eyes. What the hell is that? General Creed didn't answer, but his jaw had set tight, because he knew. You don't get that insignia unless you've bled through something no one is allowed to talk about. Shadow Echo Division, tier black, off-roster, non-attributed, missions where survival wasn't expected, operators whose names weren't even redacted because they were never entered. And yet, here she was. She lowered the marker, capped it without flourish. Still hadn't said a word. The lead engineer spoke up, hesitant. "Ma'am, respectfully, that stall point, we haven't modeled it that way. You're suggesting there's a reaction window at what, 0.61 seconds? She finally turned to face them. Just one sentence. Only if you're trained to feel it before the system reports it. Another beat of silence. Then Monroe stood, walked slowly around the table, not out of challenge, but something closer to recognition. His voice had dropped a register. "You're not staff, are you?" She shook her head once. "Not smug, not arrogant, just honest." "No. Captain, I'm Operative 6, Shadow Echo. I walked out of Ember Phi alone, and I never stopped listening." What appeared on the whiteboard wasn't a doodle. It wasn't guesswork. It was control. Her hand moved with calm. Rehearsed precision, like someone who'd sketched this solution under pressure before, in seconds. Harper Lang drew the Spectre F-39's airframe clean. Technical, correct. Then, at the point of chaos, she added one subtle line, a 3-inch strip of metal, angled just right enough to stabilize the vortex before it ever touched the engine. No excess explanation, no sales pitch, just what was needed, and nothing more. The room froze. Colonel Thorne looked like he'd forgotten how to speak. That's not possible," he whispered. But no one agreed, because everyone knew exactly what had just happened. General Creed rose from his chair. Slowly, his eyes weren't on the whiteboard. They were on her sleeve. There it was. The Raven insignia, matte black, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. "Captain Lang," one of the engineers asked in disbelief. Creed didn't blink. "On paper," he said, "she resigned." Then his voice dropped. "But off paper, she never really left." He stepped forward. "Operations, pull up her file." The aide scrambled to obey. Seconds later, the whiteboard flickered away, replaced by a sterile dossier. Lang, Harper E. Rank Captain, status active. Tier black, clearance assigned. Flight Ops 4117, Shadow Echo Division. Flight hours 4530 plus. Aircraft certified, redacted. Echo X, Ravenlock. F-39. Specialization, unpowered flight dynamics. Asymmetric propulsion recovery. The room didn't breathe. Harper didn't speak. Instead, she turned toward the 3D map still projected at the center of the briefing table terrain model of Canyon Vale, spinning slowly. She pointed, "Your current flight path is a trap. The terrain shifted east by 60 meters after a landslide in Phase 9. You're flying into a false window." Another officer leaned forward. "Then, what's the alternate?" Harper didn't hesitate. "Echo 5 corridor, 400 feet higher, narrower, but stable." A long pause. Then Monroe asked, stunned, "Did you calculate that from satellite?" She shook her head. "I flew it 3 nights ago. No uplink, no lights, just instinct. And from the back of the room." A voice cut the silence, half incredulous, half afraid. "Then who the hell have we been briefing this entire week?" Creed didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the answer was standing at the front of the room, holding nothing but a marker. And she had just rewritten everything. The salute held for a full second longer than regulation. General Mason Creed stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes locked before lowering his hand with quiet finality. His voice, when it returned, had shifted. Less command, more recognition. "Captain Lang," he said, "that wasn't a correction. That was a recovery maneuver. You just saved this program from implosion." Harper didn't flinch. "I didn't come to save it, sir. I came to see if anyone still knew how to listen." The room stayed frozen. Not a pen clicked, not a breath moved. Creed stepped closer, his gaze flicking once more to her sleeve. That insignia. He knew it well, because once before the stars and desk and double rows of ribbons he'd worn it too. Shadow Echo Division didn't just train pilots. They trained survivors. People who could be dropped into a stall at 80,000 feet with half power and no GPS and still fly out alive. And Harper Lang, she wasn't just a graduate. She was the last one out of Ember V. He turned to the others. "You don't understand what you're looking at," Creed said quietly. She flew the Ember Rift corridor during the blackout ops. 2 weeks in total comm silence, crosswinds at 200 knots, 6 aircraft downed. She's the only reason the evac line even held, someone in the room whispered. But she's not even on the roster. Creed's reply came cold and sharp. She was never supposed to be. Harper walked back toward the center of the room, toward the mission table where the terrain projection of Canyon Vale still hovered above a pane of glass. She rotated it with 2 fingers, zooming into the narrow valley mouth. "Your target zone is compromised," she said evenly. "This terrain here," she tapped, "was restructured by a rock shift 4 months ago. You're planning an air insertion on a blind drop. Any pilot flying in on that flight path is flying into a false window." She looked up. "Unless you adjust the corridor. Reorient entry from Echo 5 instead of Alpha 2, and change altitude by 400 feet. One of the younger engineers blinked. "That fast?" "You calculated that without a data pass," Harper answered with the same calm she'd carried since the first pot of coffee. "I flew it. Night sweep. No lights, no uplink, just instinct." And in that moment, it became unmistakably clear she hadn't come back for a salute. She hadn't come back for redemption. She came back because no one else could see the drop zone from the inside. Creed exhaled. Long, heavy, then nodded once. "The floor's yours." "Captain." Harper gave a small nod. Barely more than a breath. She stepped into the center of the room, and for the first time, every high-ranking officer, every flight lead, every engineer looked to her for direction. By the time the projection faded and the lights came back up, something unspoken had shifted in the room. It wasn't just the briefing that had changed. It was the chain of command. Captain Harper Lang stood quietly at the center of the chamber, surrounded by officers who just 20 minutes earlier hadn't even seen her. Now, no one moved until she did. The mission to Canyon Vale would proceed, but not with guesswork, not with the old flight plan. With her correction, her eyes, her memory of the terrain. And not one voice questioned it. Colonel Thorne, who once mocked her as just staff, sat stiffly in the corner. He hadn't spoken since the solution appeared on the board. He didn't need to. His silence was a concession, a quiet admission that skill doesn't need permission to exist. General Creed dismissed the team with a curt nod, but several officers stayed behind. No one wanted to be the first to walk away. Harper, however, had already started moving, not toward the front, not toward a podium, but back toward the small metal cart where the half-empty carafe still sat, cooling on its burner. She lifted the pot, emptied it in the sink. That was when Captain Monroe approached, still in flight suit, still wide-eyed. "Ma'am," he said, voice low. "If it's not too forward, was it true that you flew Ember Phi solo?" She didn't answer right away. Just replaced the coffee pot, straightened the mugs. Then, with the faintest smile, I wasn't the only one flying, but I was the only one who came back. Monroe nodded. Slowly. There was nothing else to say, because that wasn't a boast. It was a eulogy. She turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold just as the first whispers began behind her. They weren't cruel anymore. Not dismissive, just reverent. The patch. I've never seen it up close. Was she in Project Ravenlock? No. Further back than that? Shadow Echo? That's Tier Black. You don't even get listed for that kind of work. They say she flew 6 aircraft no one's allowed to name. They say she once corrected an entire program with a dry erase marker. But Harper didn't wait to hear the rest. She stepped out into the Montana dusk, cool wind brushing past her collar, far above. An F-39 Spectre streaked across the sky, trailing vapor. It flew clean, no stall, no flameout, just stable. Perfect flight. She watched it fade into the horizon, a machine they had nearly buried. Saved not by rank, not by protocol, but by someone they forgot was in the room. Inside. The whiteboard still held faint ghost marks from her diagrams, and on the counter. One last cup of untouched coffee sat cooling. No one dared throw it away, because long after the files were locked again, and her name once more redacted, they'd still tell the story of the woman who stood in silence and rewrote everything.